You didn't stop believing. You just got tired. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not in some loud moment of rebellion, but slowly, quietly, like a flame that kept burning for years until it ran out of oxygen. And now, here you are. Not angry, not lost, just numb. And you've started to ask yourself, what's wrong with me? But maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe what you're calling spiritual coldness isn't distance from God. It's just the exhaustion of a soul that's been carrying too much for too long. It didn't start with doubt. It started with pressure. The pressure to always be on, to always feel connected, to always overflow with passion. You didn't walk away from God. You've just been walking through a desert, quietly, faithfully, but without water. And you're not cold. You're just empty. That's the ache that no one sees. Because on the outside, it looks like you're still standing, you still show up, you still say the right words, but inside, you're worn out. Not because you've been distant from God, but because you've spent so much time trying to prove your closeness. You kept trying to feel something, anything. But when the feelings didn't come, you told yourself, it must be you, that maybe your heart hardened, that maybe you drifted. But what if the truth is simpler and more gentle? What if you're not distant? You're just drained. No one told you that even holy things can wear you out, that even worship can feel heavy when it becomes a performance, that even prayer can feel like pressure when it turns into proving, that even faith can feel suffocating when your soul hasn't had space to breathe. Because the truth is, spiritual burnout doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like silence, like still showing up, but feeling nothing. Like watching others raise their hands in worship while you stand still, wondering if you've lost something you'll never get back. And yet, in that silence, something sacred still exists. Because God doesn't measure your love by the volume of your emotion. He doesn't equate passion with devotion. He doesn't require you to feel it to prove that you're faithful. He's not pacing heaven, waiting for you to stir up some kind of spiritual performance. He knows. He knows how hard you've tried. He knows how deeply you've wanted to stay close. He knows how exhausted you are. Not from disobedience, constantly trying to be enough. This kind of exhaustion isn't fixed by trying harder. It's not fixed by adding more hours to your prayer list or pushing through with louder praise. It's healed in gentleness, in rest, in permission. Permission to stop performing. Permission to stop faking the fire. Permission to say, I'm tired. And let that be a holy confession. Because maybe your soul doesn't need another spiritual push. Maybe it needs space. Space to be still. Space to be real. Space to exhale the weight of always trying to be on. You're not broken. You're just depleted. You don't need to fix yourself. You need to be kind to yourself. And somewhere inside, you already know that. But it's hard to believe when the silence feels like failure, when you don't feel the goosebumps anymore. When the tears don't come in worship the way they used to, when you open your Bible and stare at the page and feel nothing. But let me say this clearly. Spiritual dryness does not equal spiritual death. The desert is not proof that God has left you. It's proof that He trusts you to walk with Him even when the ground is dry. You see, not all growth feels like glory. Sometimes growth looks like this. You keep showing up even when you don't feel it. You keep whispering prayers even when they feel flat. You keep choosing love even when your soul feels heavy. That's not failure, that's faithfulness. And the God who met Elijah in the cave, the God who sat in the silence with Job, the God who wept in Gethsemane, that same God is not asking you to pretend you're okay. He's asking you to stop proving, to stop pushing, to stop equating spiritual with loud and holy, with emotional. He's not offended by your silence. He's in it. He's not waiting for you on the other side of the fire. He's in the ashes, waiting with you, holding space for the version of you that's too tired to perform. And maybe the return you've been looking for isn't some grand emotional breakthrough. Maybe it's a quiet one. Maybe it's a breath. Maybe it's a pause. Maybe it's the moment you finally stop trying to earn what was always meant to be received freely. Because God's presence isn't a reward for performance. It's a gift for those who dare to be real. So take the pressure off. Let go of the guilt. You don't need to stir anything up. You just need to rest. And in the next part, we'll explore what that rest looks like. not as a break from your faith, but as the path back to it, not through effort, but through honesty, not through striving, but through softness, because God hasn't moved, and your soul, it hasn't died, it's just tired, and the way back starts with grace. It begins so innocently, the desire to be faithful, to stay close to God, to be someone who doesn't waver. You want to feel Him, know Him, honor Him, so you push, you give more, you do more, you read more, pray more, serve more, and somewhere in the midst of that good intention, the pressure begins to grow. Not the kind of pressure that feels like a burden right away. At first, it feels like devotion, like commitment, like growth. But over time, it stops feeling like love and starts feeling like proving. You didn't notice it at first. You just wanted to do what was right. You wanted to make sure your faith was real, alive, passionate. You started measuring your closeness to God by how deeply you felt during worship, by how many hours you spent in prayer, by whether or not you had the right response when things went wrong. And somewhere along the way, your soul stopped resting. It started performing, because no one told you that even devotion can become a disguise, that even passion can be a pressure, that even your love for God can get twisted into something heavy when it becomes tied to your sense of worth. It happens to so many of us, especially those who were raised in spiritual spaces, where feelings were constantly examined, where you were taught that if you weren't on fire, then something must be wrong, where dryness wasn't allowed and doubt was seen as dangerous. So when your emotions didn't match what you were taught to feel, you panicked. You started striving instead of surrendering. You started pushing instead of pausing. You started proving instead of simply being. And you didn't do it because you were fake. You did it because you cared, because your faith mattered, because you wanted to get it right. But faith isn't something you prove. It's something you live, something you trust. And when your trust starts depending on your performance, your soul will slowly begin to shut down. And that's exactly what happened, isn't it? You still showed up. You still prayed. You still tried. But the joy started fading. The warmth, the ease, everything started to feel forced. You began asking, why don't I feel anything anymore? And instead of hearing an answer, you started blaming yourself. Maybe I'm not spiritual enough. Maybe I've let something in. Maybe God is distant because I've failed Him. But what if the only thing you let in was exhaustion? What if your soul didn't fail? It just ran out of room to breathe, because spiritual health is not about how loudly you can worship through your weariness. It's about knowing when to stop and let your soul exhale. God didn't create you to run endlessly on performance. He created you to live in rhythm, in rest, in realness. But we live in a world, and often in faith community, that reward more fire, more zeal, more productivity, more evidence that your faith is alive. And that pressure, even when it's wrapped in spiritual language, becomes the very thing that disconnects you from the intimacy you long for. Because here's the truth. Trying to feel something doesn't bring you closer to God. It only makes you more aware of what you think you're missing, and the more you try to feel, the less you actually do. That's the paradox of pressure. The more you grip your soul, the more it slips away from you. So what's the alternative? You stop gripping. You stop chasing the feeling. You stop waking up every morning asking, what do I need to do to feel spiritual again? And you start asking, what would it look like to let God meet me in this exact place, even if I don't feel Him? Because that's where the healing begins. When you stop trying to manufacture a connection, and you start allowing space for real, honest communion. When you stop needing your relationship with God to look alive, and you start trusting that it is, even in silence, even in simplicity. You don't need to perform love to be loved. You don't need to perform passion to be close. You don't need to manufacture tears or force your hands in the air just to prove that you're still in it. God isn't asking you to show Him something you don't have. He's asking you to give Him what you do have, even if that's just emptiness, even if that's just stillness, even if that's just the breath you take when you sit quietly and whisper, I'm here. That's all I've got today. Because what you call all I've got, He calls enough. That's the heart of grace. Not that you finally reached the right emotional state, not that you climbed your way back to fire and fervor, but that you learned how to receive again. Receive without proving. rest without guilt, be without striving. And when that begins to settle into your bones, something beautiful happens. You start to come back to life, gently. You start to feel again, not because you chased it, but because you rested into it. You start to realize that your soul never stopped believing. It just needed a break from trying to look like belief. And the moment you stop trying to prove that you love God, you begin to experience His love for you in a whole new way. In the next part, we'll talk about what it means to rebuild your spiritual rhythm, not with pressure, but with presence. How to return to God from a place of honesty, not performance. And how to begin again, not because you feel ready, but because your soul is finally safe enough to stop running. Because you don't need to show God your strength, you just need to show up. There's a strange kind of pain that comes when you stop trying to feel close to God and still feel nothing. You've done everything they told you to do. You read the verses. You repeated the declaration. You asked Him to speak, to show you something, to break through the numbness. And yet, the silence remains, not as punishment, not as abandonment, but as something you can't quite name. And in that silence, a thought begins to grow, one you don't want to admit out loud, one that feels almost wrong to say, what if I've drifted too far? What if He's not here anymore? But that thought doesn't come from rebellion, it comes from heartbreak, because you miss Him. Not just the idea of Him, the experience of Him, the nearness, the connection, the intimacy that once came so easily, the tears during worship, the joy during prayer, the sense of peace that covered you even in chaos. Where did it go? You try not to spiral. You tell yourself it's just a phase. You try to stir it back up. Maybe if I pray harder. Maybe if I cry more. Maybe if I fast longer. But here's the truth you don't want to believe. It's not working. Not because you've failed, but because the thing you're trying to reignite doesn't live in effort. It lives in rest. It's a hard truth to sit with, especially when you've been conditioned to equate closeness with intensity. But the presence of God is not always loud. It's not always emotional. It's not always felt. Sometimes it's just there, steady, quiet, unwavering, even when you feel completely disconnected. And that's the sacred paradox. God doesn't always show up how you expect, but He always shows up. You're not being ignored, you're being invited into a new kind of faith, one that doesn't rely on emotional proof, one that doesn't need to be constantly recharged by spiritual experience, one that doesn't fall apart the moment your feelings go quiet. This is the faith that grows in stillness, the faith that roots deep, the kind of faith that doesn't just believe when the fire is hot, but still whispers yes when the fire burns low, because true connection with God isn't based on the temperature of your emotion. It's built on trust, and trust is never more real than when it's tested in silence. But let's be honest, silence can feel cruel when you're already carrying shame. It becomes easy to confuse quiet with punishment. Easy to believe that if God were really close, you'd feel something by now. That if your faith were stronger, your heart wouldn't feel this dull. That if you were doing better, you wouldn't have to keep begging for a single sign that He hasn't left. But God doesn't operate on the currency of your guilt. He doesn't hide to teach you a lesson. He doesn't pull away when you're weak. He doesn't withdraw His love because your hands are too tired to lift in worship. That's not who He is. He's the God who draws near to the weary, the God who comes close to the broken, the God who sits with you in silence when words feel too heavy to speak. You don't need to perform passion to keep Him close. You don't need to conjure emotion to stay connected. You don't need to pretend to be on fire when your soul is barely flickering. He's not asking for noise. He's asking for honesty. So what if, instead of trying to feel more, you just let yourself be? Let yourself be where you are. Let yourself sit in the tension. Let yourself admit that you don't know how to get back, and that maybe you're not supposed to. Because maybe this isn't about going back to how things used to be. Maybe this is about going deeper, deeper into trust, deeper into presence, deeper into a kind of intimacy that doesn't rise and fall with the emotion of the moment. Maybe God isn't calling you to return to your old passion. Maybe He's calling you to redefine what connection looks like. And that shift, it changes everything. Because now, you stop chasing moments, and you start noticing presence. You begin to realize that God is in the quiet cup of coffee, in the slow walk around the block, in the breath you take when your thoughts won't slow down, in the sigh you release and you realize, I don't have to prove anything today. You start seeing Him not just in revival, but in routine, not just in mountaintops, but in mornings, not just in answered prayers, but in unanswered ones that still haven't broken you. And in that shift, you begin to heal, you begin to rest, you begin to understand that what you thought was spiritual coldness was just your soul asking for space. Not because you failed, because you're human, because the rhythm you were living in was unsustainable, because the pressure to always feel had become a weight your soul could no longer carry. And now, in the stillness, in the absence of performance, you're finally starting to hear the voice that's been speaking all along. It doesn't say, try harder. It says, come rest. In the next part, we'll explore what that rest looks like in real life, how to stop spiritualizing exhaustion and start honoring your soul's need for gentleness, how to rebuild a relationship with God that isn't built on effort, but on ease, and how to let go of the belief that you have to climb your way back to Him, when in reality, He's been walking beside you the entire time. At some point, you stop asking God to set your heart on fire, not because you've given up, but because you've finally realized it's not the fire that heals, it's the rest after the burning. This is where your soul begins to unlearn the urgency, where you start releasing the weight of always needing to get back to how things were, the emotion, the passion, the fire, the tears. Because now, you're learning to breathe differently, to stop seeing spiritual vitality as something loud or dramatic, to start recognizing that healing rarely arrives in a roar, it arrives in a whisper, and sometimes it shows up dressed as stillness. That stillness isn't laziness, it's not complacency, it's recovery, because somewhere along the way, we were taught that movement equals growth, that if you're not feeling something, you're not doing it right, that if your faith is quiet, it must be weak. But growth is not always loud, healing is not always visible, and sometimes rest is not what you do after you've fixed everything. It's the very thing that begins the fixing. The soul needs rest the same way the body does, but not just physical rest, emotional, spiritual, relational rest. The kind that lets you exhale after years of trying to measure up. The kind that lets you sit with God and say, I don't have anything to prove anymore. This is the rest you didn't know you were allowed to take, because for so long, you equated spiritual depth with spiritual output. You thought consistency meant constantly showing up, pushing through, performing when your heart wasn't in it. You thought that passion meant pressure, but real passion doesn't pressure. It invites, it expands, it breathes. And maybe for the first time, you're realizing that you don't need to force your return to God. You need to relax into it, because intimacy doesn't grow through pressure. It grows through presence. Think about the most meaningful relationships in your life. They don't require constant excitement to stay alive. They survive the quiet. They thrive in the mundane. They find their rhythm not in the peak, but in the steady presence of showing up. And God, more than anyone, knows that about you. He's not pacing heaven waiting for you to generate more energy. He's not demanding that you push past your numbness to prove your love. He knows your soul. He created it, and He knows what it needs, even when you've forgotten how to listen. Maybe what it needs right now is gentleness, the kind that lets you wake up and not rush straight into spiritual duty, the kind that lets you sit with your Bible open, even if you don't read a word, and still believe He's near, the kind that lets your prayer be a sigh, not a speech, the kind that doesn't rush you out of your silence, but honors it as sacred space. Because the pressure to be on all the time, it's not from God. That's the residue of religion, the voice of spiritual performance. And your soul is not a machine made for constant output. It's a living thing. It needs water, light, rest, and time. And here's the beautiful part. God's presence doesn't leave just because your passion does. He doesn't abandon you in the waiting. He meets you there, not to push you into action, but to hold you in the pause. He is the God of rhythms, not rush. The God of slow seasons, not just supernatural moments. The God who whispered in the stillness, not in the storm. You don't have to ignite yourself. You just have to stop running long enough for him to rekindle what's already there. So what if this moment, this quiet, dry, seemingly unspiritual moment, is actually holy? What if it's not an interruption in your faith journey, but a deepening of it? Because real faith is forged in these moments, not when everything is clear, not when your heart is on fire, but when you stay, even when it's quiet, even when it's dry, even when nothing inside you feels worthy or alive. This is where trust becomes real, and this is where God meets you, not with demands, but with rest. So here's the invitation. Don't try to climb your way back to connection. Don't chase a feeling that no longer fits the season you're in. Let yourself come back gently. Let worship look like walking. Let prayer sound like silence. Let faith feel like stillness. Because the God you met in the fire is also the God waiting for you in the quiet field. The God who once moved in your shouting is now moving in your breath. The God who welcomed your passion now welcomes your weariness. You don't have to force anything. You just have to let go of the belief that you're only valuable when you're on fire, because you're still his, even here, even now, even without the feeling. In the next part, we'll talk about what it looks like to trust this new rhythm, how to build a life of sustainable spirituality that honors your limits and holds space for your humanity. Because you weren't created to impress God. You were created to walk with him. And sometimes, walking means resting in his pace. And now, maybe for the first time in a long time, you're breathing again. Not because the fire has returned, not because the passion exploded back into your chest, but because something softer, something more sacred, is unfolding inside you. Permission. Permission to be human. Permission to be where you are. Permission to be enough, even without the spark. You're beginning to realize that all the weight you've carried, all the pressure to keep proving you're doing well spiritually, wasn't placed on you by God. It was something you picked up along the way. Maybe from religious culture, maybe from expectations you put on yourself, maybe from fear that if you slowed down, you'd slip too far. But now, you've slowed, you've paused, and instead of losing your faith, you've discovered it again. Not as performance, but as presence. This is where faith becomes more than belief. It becomes belonging, because even without the fire, you're still held. Even without the words, you're still heard. Even without the emotion, you're still loved. And maybe that's what God's been waiting to show you all along. That his love was never dependent on your energy, your effort, or your emotional state. He wasn't measuring your value by your devotion. He was waiting for you to remember that you were never meant to earn what was always meant to be received. So now, instead of chasing revival, you start choosing rhythm. Instead of forcing a return to who you used to be, you begin discovering who you are now, and you find that this version of you is softer, wiser, more honest, more free. You begin rebuilding from the ground up, not in fear, not in guilt, but in grace. You relearn what spiritual health actually looks like. And it's not grand gestures or constant emotion. It's small choices, gentle moments, sustainable rhythms, the kind that don't leave you drained. They fill you without force. It looks like sitting with your journal, not because you need to have a revelation, but because it helps you be present with yourself. It looks like walking through the park and simply noticing the light through the trees, the sound of birds, the steadiness of your own footsteps, and realizing that God is still here. It looks like praying without a plan, without a list, without needing to say the right thing, just breathing and trusting that he hears even what you don't have the words for. You begin to notice how spirituality becomes richer when it's quieter, when it's no longer about performing for God, but about partnering with him in the slow, daily healing of your own soul. You stop asking, "How do I feel?" and start asking, "What do I need?" You stop chasing goosebumps and start noticing grace. And that grace, it shows up everywhere. It shows up when you forgive yourself for missing a day. It shows up when you say no to pressure that used to make you feel holy. It shows up when you're honest with a friend and don't feel ashamed afterward. It shows up when you finally stop over-explaining why you're tired and just let yourself rest. Because you're learning that God doesn't need your performance. He desires your presence. Not the perfect you, not the passionate you, just you. The one who wakes up unsure but still chooses love. The one who no longer needs to force worship, because you've discovered that worship can be a quiet nod to heaven in the middle of a long day. The one who doesn't fear silence anymore, because silence is no longer a sign of distance, it's where you now feel most at peace. You've come home, not just to God, but to yourself. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that the fire came back, but that you learned to walk without it and found that the light inside you never left, that it wasn't passion that kept you close. It was presence. It wasn't zeal that carried you through. It was grace. And now you know, not just in your head, but in your bone, that love doesn't need to be proven to exist. It just is. So, as you step into whatever comes next, you do it differently. You don't rush. You don't strive. You don't chase the next spiritual high. You listen. You trust. You stay grounded. Because now, your faith is not a fire to fan constant. It's a flame that lives within you. It doesn't need to be loud to be real. It doesn't need to be emotional to be powerful. It just needs space. Space to breathe. Space to be. Space to live. You are not behind. You are not disconnected. You are not cold. You are healing. And healing isn't always bright and glorious. Sometimes healing is soft. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it's simply saying, I'm tired, and letting God hold you, not fix you, not rush you, just be with you. That's where you are now. And from here, anything is possible. Because when your return to God is no longer driven by guilt or striving, but by tenderness and trust, that's when it becomes real. That's when your soul stops performing and starts belonging. And that, more than any fire, is what brings you home.